Welcome to Therapy Unplugged, Empowerment, Laughter, and Life, a podcast where two therapists offer insights to the real-life issues we all experience. We are your hosts, Sarah Benoit and Megan McCullough. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about overwhelm. It's something everyone experiences at some point, and at times it can feel debilitating. Today, Megan and I want to have a conversation about what does overwhelm look like and what does it feel like to be overwhelmed, how and why it happens, and practical strategies to navigate and manage those feelings. Megan, would you like to lead us off today?
I would love to. Thanks, Sarah. So, welcome everyone. We're really excited to be here doing our second episode, and I'm excited to focus our second episode on chronic overwhelm.
Mhm.
I think it's just a really good natural segue from our first episode, in which we kind of touched right on all of these different issues and themes that clients come to us with. And I would say, I don't know if you agree or not, but many of the themes and issues that clients come to session with absolutely can lead to chronic overwhelm. So it just feels like a really good topic for us to focus on.
Mhm.
And one thing that I did want to kind of distinguish about our topic today is that from my perspective, I see a difference between chronic day to day overwhelm, which is what we're going to address today, versus more of the kind of overwhelm that naturally occurs with big life events.
Mhm.
Right. So perhaps, and they can be positive events too. I don't necessarily mean they're negative. Like maybe you're getting married, or maybe you're moving across the country.
Mhm. Very good point.
Maybe it is a negative event, like, you lose your job,
Mhm.
you get divorced, right? So whether it's a positive or negative big life event, I think it's just a natural response to feel temporary overwhelm.
Mm.
So that's not what we're talking about so much today. I think what we're talking about is, and Sarah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but I see in my practice when clients come to me in session, this almost the sense of being overloaded just with the day to day. So we might be talking about chronic overwhelm that perhaps you wake up in the morning and you're feeling this sense of kind of dread or
Mhm.
stress, and you might not even be sure where it's coming from.
Mhm.
And you go through your day, and then you fall asleep at night with that same sense of heaviness, that same sense of overload or overwhelm. So I think that's what I'm hoping to talk about today. Do you have any
Okay.
thoughts on that? Yeah.
Well, yes, I think we can look at overwhelm. I think you bring up an interesting point. It's very easy to get overwhelmed, and I'm glad you brought up that it could be something positive or negative.
Mhm.
But there can be things like, this is a personal one. Like I hate going to the grocery store. I find it incredibly overwhelming.
Mm,
Especially given certain, like today with the storm coming, that's the last place I want to be.
right.
But that's also temporary. I mean, that doesn't, do I want to do it? No. Is it going to make me frustrated if I do go? Probably. But what we're talking about is kind of maybe, so if you're overwhelmed, a lot of times I hear two different things. I hear there's a physical component and then there's the mental component. So physical component could be things like, well, I'm fatigued, could be pain, whether that's chronic pain, depending on where you carry things in your body, headaches, stomach aches, back pain. I hear things from people like, and this happens to me when I'm overwhelmed, I can't think. It's really hard for me to gather my thoughts. And, that's where I think it becomes when you have, say, multiples of these, that's where it can become debilitating too. Because then if you're getting frustrated or if you are, say, in this constant state of angst, okay, now I'm always anxious. What's going on? So I think it can manifest in a couple of different ways. And part of what I'm hearing from you is that it is, in terms of this chronic piece, this is something that happens day after day. You can't get yourself out of it. It might have that heavy feeling to
Right.
it.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly, and I love that you just said you feel like you can't get yourself out of it, because that feels like a big component to the kind of chronic overwhelm that I'm talking about. I think there's a level of, right, like, almost, I don't know if helplessness is the right word here, but this sense of, "I don't know how to feel lighter. I don't know
Hmm.
how to start to, I'm juggling so many plates. How do I start to lessen my load?" And
Mhm.
so I just see it so frequently that it seems like a really good thing for us to talk about.
I hear this a lot, and I don't know if you do, but I'm curious. One of the phrases, either directly or not in so many words, people will say to me, they'll say, I feel like things are out of control, or I feel out of
Mhm.
control.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm curious, what do you see for others, and maybe even for yourself? Like, what contributes to that
Mm.
chronic overwhelm?
Yeah, so great question, and I think that there's no simple answer because there's
Mhm,
so many things in today's age that can contribute, right?
mhm,
A general answer to that question, and then maybe we'll both get into some more specifics about what
mhm,
we think causes overwhelm. But in general, excuse me, I would say that we are overloaded in so many different ways these days. So, what do I mean by that? We're overloaded by commitments, right?
mm,
Whether we're talking about commitments at work, commitments at home, if you have children or pets, there's just so many different responsibilities and commitments that go along with taking care of someone else,
mhm.
right? So I think that's one way we're overloaded. Another way we're overloaded is with information, and
Very
I would
true.
speak yeah, I would speak specifically to technology on that one. Um,
Mhm,
Information is an amazing thing, and I will just speak for myself personally. I know that some days I'm like, "Man, if I try to read one more book or one more article or watch one more even like a YouTube video on something that could be really worth watching," right?
mhm.
These are worthy endeavors, but at what point just do these worthy endeavors just become more of an overload? Um, when maybe what we're needing is to go take a walk in nature,
Right.
right? So that's kind of a general answer to what causes overwhelm. Do you have any
Okay.
thoughts on that?
I think I wanna just kinda reiterate, I think you brought up a really good point, which is it's not just the kind of the inputs, but it's also, I think, we take pride in doing a lot of things, of multitasking, of accomplishing, whatever that looks like.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of people, and I don't say this with a negative spin, but a lot of people want to make other people happy, want to make them comfortable.
Mhm.
So they will take on. They'll say, "Oh, sure, I can take care of that for you," or "I'll do that." Or, "Sure, do you need me to go run this errand?" And the next thing you know, you're sitting there going, "What did I just commit to?
Exactly.
And I've gotta do all this now. How am I supposed to do all this?" And so I think there's that, but then I think there's other things that contribute, again, on a kind of broader brush are it's this idea of uncertainty. So it can be maybe you're going through major life changes. Maybe maybe it's something going on with your partner or with your extended family. Maybe it's something bigger, whether it's something in your job, or even if you think of um, a lot of people are overwhelmed financially, whether they, let's just say as an example, they're living beyond their means. Even if they're not living beyond their means, money in particular is something that causes people a lot of angst, a lot of stress.
Mhm.
And so I think, kind of like those overarching things that are part of life that we all have to deal with, like bills and everything else. I think there's some other things that can contribute too, which, again, if you're in a grieving process, that can feel incredibly overwhelming because obviously you're grieving. There might be some logistical things you need to take care of depending on what your role is. You may be trying to manage your own life, your own job, while managing that all at the same time. There could be, again, from that trauma lens, if you have trauma, if you've experienced trauma, and let's just say you haven't processed it or you're in the process of dealing with it, that can feel incredibly overwhelming.
Mhm.
You may not understand what you're feeling. You may not feel safe. You may not feel grounded. And all of that, kind of can play a role here.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and, I would just add a couple of more things to
Mhm.
that I think can be directly related, um, and these are really, uh in some ways, they're very basic things, but in another way, I think they're very hard for us to achieve. So, good sleep hygiene,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, I think that, sleep hygiene is something that is so overlooked, especially in our society, and if you're getting poor sleep, there's just in my this is just my humble opinion, but there's no way that that's not going to contribute to a sense of overwhelm when things start to feel stressful. I mean, I don't know about you, Sarah, but if I can get 8 hours sleep, man, I the next day, usually even and there's always gonna be bumps in the road, but even when those bumps come, I can handle them.
Mhm.
But if I have a night where I'm waking up frequently, my cat wants to be fed or I'm too warm or, on and on and on, I the whole day looks different, and it's
Right.
really a struggle to stay centered, which I guess you could say would be the opposite of feeling overwhelmed, right? Like you're yeah.
Yeah. And that's a great point. I'm very much, if I don't get good sleep,
Mhm.
it's all bets are off. And the other, the other thing that goes with that too is they do run hand in hand. Is a Are you eating well? Are you staying
Yep,
hydrated? Are you getting enough sleep? Like all of that contributes. And if you
self-care.
think of right, and if you think of being overwhelmed, a lot of times it's putting one foot in front of the other. So you're not thinking about did I prep my meals for the day or is this a healthy meal? You might be skipping meals or you might be saying, "Hey, I'm just going to grab what I can." And
Mhm,
it could be, full of sugar or it could be just kind of, not good energy food. And that is going to affect how you think and how you process and problem solve. And if you're not doing a good job with that, you could get frustrated. So it's like that
mhm.
whole circle, it really snowballs. It happens very quickly and very easily.
Absolutely, yeah. Yep, and, if it's okay, I'll add one more to that.
Of course, of course.
There's so many causes, right? But just one that's really popping up for me in the moment to say, because I hear this time and time again from my clients, is poor time management,
Yes.
right? I hear this from so many clients that they struggle with managing their time, um, that they struggle with their ability to prioritize tasks.
Mhm.
And so rather than maybe focusing on 2 or 3 things in a day, they'll have a to-do list that's 2 pages long. And I mean, I have literally seen clients' to-do lists that are 2 pages long, and my first thought to them or question, and I'll say this in a gentle way, but is how, like, of course you're feeling overwhelmed if you're
Right.
expecting to get this much done in one day. And I guess that goes
Mhm.
back to what you already stated about taking on too much, right?
Mhm.
Um, yeah,
And it's interesting, one of the things I thought of 2 other things while you were talking, and one, I think overwhelm can very easily tie into our first episode around one of the primary theme that you brought up is, "I am not enough."
yeah,
And if you think of it, one of the other that that's been kind of rolling around in my brain as we've been talking is that can be a real root for some people is why do they overcommit? Or, why do they feel like things are so out of control? And that kind of led me down to the other, I think, possible core for some people, not everybody, but they can feel overwhelmed if they have a perfectionism streak.
mhm,
If that is, I see this a lot and I've been there. I mean, I've gotten a lot better personally around perfectionism, but every area of my life that I used to focus on that, like I had to be perfect in the way, like what clothes I was choosing and what jewelry I was
mhm.
choosing and what work I was doing and how I was behaving with people and like what image I was putting out there. And fortunately, I've gotten a lot better around that, but the pressure that comes with that, and I hear this a lot from people where, especially if they have kids, it's like, I need to be this perfect parent. I don't want to screw my kids up. So
Yeah.
I need to do this, this, and this. And the reminder is, okay, you're human and you're not perfect and you can't do everything. None of us can do everything.
Yes, 100% agree, and I love that you linked it back to this inner dialogue that we
Mhm.
talked about last week, and I have a feeling that inner dialogue is going to come up over and over and again in our episodes because it really is the core of a lot, right, of what we're talking about. So, yeah, if you are walking around with this feeling that I am not enough, well, what would the solution be, right? I suppose it would be, well, I better do more, right? I better be more, or
Mhm.
right? I better be a better mother. I be a better wife or husband. I better be a better employee. I mean, you name it. It goes on and on and on. So changing that inner dialogue, which I guess is probably one of the strategies we might be
Yep.
talking about, right? So did you have any other thoughts though, on anything that we've talked about before we kind of move into that?
No, I think we've kind of covered I think we've covered all of the, kind of the whys. I mean, at least that were on my list. I'm sure there are tons of others out there for people and I would throw out there too, as people are listening, if you want to share,
Yeah.
um, in the comments section, whether it's whether you can relate to this or different examples, maybe that we haven't thought of, we certainly welcome that. We welcome your input and your feedback.
Absolutely. Like, what does overwhelm mean to you? How does
Hmm.
it manifest?
Right.
Yeah, and again, if there's topics that come up for you connected to overwhelm that you would like us to talk about, just let us know.
Mhm. One thing I just want to share this. I hadn't thought about it till you just said that. Um, One of the things that contributes to overwhelm is people's mental health.
Mhm.
And if they, so for example, if they're an anxious person or if they're depressed or if they have ADHD or, I mean, there's, whatever it is, one of the things I see, and I say this to people a lot in my practice, is if there is something that's happening, and let's just say it is, what's the word I'm looking for here? Maybe a maladaptive coping strategy. Um, I always say to people, okay, but how does this serve you? Because there's a reason why you're using it. And I think that's also one of the things that kind of can happen with chronic overwhelm is that it serves the person. It may get them out of certain things.
Mm.
So, if I'm overwhelmed, I can't do X or it prevents me from doing X. And that could be because, I mean, that could be a lot of things, but it could be a fear, it could be an insecurity that's
Mhm.
at the root of that. Um, and as we're getting into strategies, one of the things that makes me think about is kind of getting to, okay, when you're overwhelmed, I think it's important to really chunk things down on a couple levels. One is a real practical level, like looking at, okay, I've got 3 projects ahead of me. Am I going to look at all 3? Am I going to
Right.
pick one? Am I going to chunk that down to little task lists, that kind of thing? But then I also think on an emotional level, chunking it down to get to the root of why am I feeling this way?
Right.
What's happening? What's causing this? Identifying those feelings, because sometimes it's really easy to get caught up in the fact that, feelings aren't rational. They don't make sense.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's when that happens, if you're able to sit with it and say, okay, this is just a feeling. It's not good. It's not bad. It's just a feeling. But I need to understand, like, why are these feelings popping up right now around this issue that's then contributing to me feeling like whether it's I don't have any control or I'm
Right.
spinning or I can't think.
Absolutely. So there's self-inquiry, right, that goes
Yes,
along with, so you identify you're overwhelmed, and then I think what I'm hearing you say is, right, you do this process of self-inquiry and really try to get to the root of the why.
right.
Um, yeah, and I know we already mentioned this strategy, but just because I feel like it's so important, and I think it goes along with what you're talking about right now. A
Mhm.
lot of times when you do that self-inquiry, you may discover that, wow, okay, my inner dialogue is constantly telling me something negative about myself.
Right.
Um, and so that to me, that's a really powerful strategy to start to implement, which is, and again, this is the, this is the hypnotherapist coming out in me, but what, you know, what statements can I get on board with that are feeling better than, I'm not enough.
Mhm.
Um, and again, there's so many simple ones to choose, but they're not easy. I am enough is huge. I think that's a big one, but there's all kinds of
Right.
statements, right? I don't know if you have any kind of in your pocket that that you want to share, but
I would say I'm capable. I'm in
mm,
control.
yes,
I'm secure. I'm safe. I'm grounded. And the grounding one is an interesting one because that doesn't people don't always feel grounded. Um, and one of the things I think, and I don't know if you agree with this, but that kind of goes hand in hand with that positive dialogue. Um, when you are feeling overwhelmed or out of control, and I don't know if how you would handle this in a session if someone sat down in front of you and said, "Okay, Megan, this is like I can't think, I'm spinning, and they're not even making sense really." One of the things I think that's important is to use all of our senses.
yes,
And what I would say to someone doing that, like I would have them focus on, okay, what do you see? What are you hearing right now? What do you
Mhm.
feel? What do
Mhm.
you smell? If you're drinking something or eating something, what do you taste? Um, because I find that really kind of it centers the central nervous system. It brings those levels down where it's like, okay, I'm more grounded to the earth. I'm more in touch with myself, um, so that I can then maybe even form those positive sentences in
Yeah.
my head about
Yeah.
myself.
Very good point. You're right. That might need to come first,
Mm,
right? So you're grounding really, I think another way to talk about what you're saying is that you're grounding yourself in the present moment and you're getting yourself out of your head a little bit. You're
yeah.
getting that broader view or kind of what we talked about even last week, right? Like that 30,000-foot view. It's like you're distancing yourself enough from the overwhelm by coming back down to the present and just focusing on what is right in front of you,
Hmm.
whether it's what you see, what you feel, what you hear. Um, so, yes, absolutely. That's super important.
It's interesting. I just thought about this, but now that we're doing this podcast, I find that I am more aware in my everyday life of, say, whatever our next topic is going to be.
Mhm, mhm.
So this morning, I had to bring my car into the dealership, and I'm at this light, and I look at the car behind me, and it was hard to find the person because there was so much crap in this person's car. Like, I kid you not, like, I think it was mail that was piled up in the middle. So, like,
Mm,
the driver was there and there was stuff all along the dash, but in the middle, it was piled so high, it literally went halfway up the windshield.
wow.
And I actually kind of like, I got anxious, and I just thought that that would be so overwhelming for me to drive in that vehicle. Not just I couldn't drive it, but just to even be a passenger. And what that reminded me of course, was then, okay, this might be a good example as we talk today. But one of the things that I think is important too is to have, if you can, and I know it's not always easy, but to clean your space. Make sure your space is in
Mhm.
order,
Yes. Yep.
because if your space is in order, your mind generally feels in order.
Absolutely. Completely agree. I'm glad you brought that one up. That one I didn't even think of that one,
Mm,
but, a cluttered space, I don't think people realize how much their surroundings or their environment can then contribute, right, to their inner state.
yes, yes. And I know, even, I mean, I'm not the neatest person, but I can only get to a certain point where let things go to a certain point, and then I'm like, this has to be cleaned up. This needs
Mhm,
to have a sense
mhm,
of order. And
mhm.
I even find sometimes, and this is kind of that, I think we talked a little bit before in the last episode, that mind body connection, where if someone comes into my office and they're super anxious and they're super overwhelmed to the point that they're speaking very rapidly,
Mhm.
if they do this for a long time, I notice I have to look inward and say, okay, am I good? Am I truly listening? Because I find I hold my breath.
Mm.
And so I think it's also interesting in terms of, because I think it's very easy for some people to be, for lack of a better way of putting it, a sponge.
Yeah.
Energetically, you can take on other people's energy. And I think it's really important to pay attention to, if you are overwhelmed, is this your stuff or is
Mhm.
it someone else's stuff?
Yes.
And if you're not the person who's overwhelmed, are you guarding, kind of managing your own resources and energy so that you aren't traveling down that path too? And maybe even not just owning theirs, but then contributing, not intentionally, to their spinning out cycle.
Yes. Yep, and, that might be a good segue. I have one more strategy I definitely do wanna mention, and I think
Mhm.
it's related to what you're talking about here, and that is, learning to set healthy boundaries,
Yeah, so
right?
important.
Yeah, and so, this comes up a lot again in session, which is why I'm bringing it up to the wider audience because I'm sure it's not just my clients, but, learning that it's okay to say no, right? Like, that's
Mhm.
one type of boundary that I think that just as human beings, we're not great about. We're constantly saying yes, even when maybe we don't mean it, which gets back
Yep.
again to the taking on too much and the I'm not enough and all of that. Um, but there's other kinds of boundaries too that I think maybe you were speaking to, almost more of those energetic boundaries, right? Like
Mm.
what because if I'm questioning what is my stuff, right? What is my responsibility to take on? And let's just say I'm talking about my son. Okay.
Mhm.
So I'm sure I was going to share this at some point. I'll share it today. So my son is on the autism spectrum and he's older now. He's 21, but I can share with you that one of the things that probably caused and still does at times, although it's gotten a lot better, but just significant amount of overwhelm as he was growing up was just like this sense of my wanting him to have friends
Mhm.
and my wanting him to have genuine connection with his peers. And so while that's all well and good, what was sometimes happening was that I was almost taking that on as my own, right?
Mm.
So let's just say again, I'm talking years ago because he's older now, but he might come home from school feeling really down or really upset about something that maybe another child said to him or feeling like he was ignored or whatever. And I would actually I realize now I was actually taking on that burden as if it was my own rather than seeing it for what it was, right?
Mhm.
Helping him, supporting him, listening to him, finding solutions, of course, but not energetically taking it on. So I think
Mm.
sometimes our boundaries got really messy. Um,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. So I think that that is just an important I think boundaries is certainly an important topic, not only in this episode on chronic overwhelm, right? But that's probably another thing that's gonna come up a lot for us.
Yes. Yeah, and thank you for sharing that because I think that's it's important to kind of I mean, and what I'm hearing is a lot in there. There was that self-reflection piece too where you were able to kind of say, "Okay, what is mine and what is his?"
Mhm.
And but also, I'm sure that was probably challenging given that, of course, you're his parent, you want what's best for him.
Oh, yeah.
And, and also realizing too, how much of this do you have control over,
Correct.
right? Because he's his
Which
own
gets back to
person.
what you were saying. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, one other thing I want to link back to, and you said this earlier, which I think was pretty important, is that a lot of your clients are coming in and it's that idea of time management.
Yeah.
And I have had a couple of people, I mean, the same thing where it's interesting. Like I can help people, I think, to an extent with that because I think of the things that work for me. Um,
Mhm.
but I also think I do okay with time management. So it's not as much of a struggle. But and this isn't how my brain necessarily works, but there are a ton of apps out there
Yeah.
that are specific to time management. Like I've got one client who uses it's called Splitty and another one that uses Todoist. And I personally haven't tried either one of those. when I was kind of doing my research, it was interesting. I found that and I'm happy to put this for people in the description, but there are a bunch of different apps so if you're looking at how to mitigate stress and anxiety, the apps that are helpful, through that. If you're looking for the physical part of it,
Yeah.
there are apps that help with that. What I found was interesting, and I can't remember which one. I did download one to try it, and personally, it drove me nuts because I'm not married to my phone, and
Mhm.
so but it had these features where it would remind you, and then once you completed your task, you check it off, you get like these
Mhm.
kudos, and I thought, okay, if this is something that I was struggling with, I could see where this would really be helpful.
Yeah.
What I found to be challenging was I forgot about it, and then the next day, my phone was blowing up like, "Okay, what's on your to-do list for today? What are we tackling?" And I'm like, "Oh, go away."
So
Uh,
was it contributing to your overwhelm
yes,
more than it was helping? Right, but that's because you didn't need it, right? But
right.
I'm really I'm really glad you're bringing it up because for people that do struggle with time management or executive functioning skills, right? Like executive
Mhm.
functioning skills is just your ability to kind of like plan like okay, if I want C to happen, I've got to do A and B first, right? And for
Right.
some people, this comes naturally. I think, like for you and I, it comes naturally. But I can tell you, for my son, whew,
Mhm.
is executive functioning tricky. And I'm really glad you brought up the apps because I can add one more to the list that he uses. It's called Goblin Tools.
Oh.
And Goblin Tools has all kinds of different things that it does, and I am not an expert on it at all. I don't use it, but he does. But just to give one quick example of what it can do. So let's say you get overwhelmed with let's say cleaning, okay? And
Mhm.
so he can get very overwhelmed if I say to him like when he was younger, if I just said, you really need to go and clean your room, um, and now to me, that seems obvious what would need to be done. But for somebody with whether it's ADHD or just you don't even have to have ADHD, but just poor time management skills,
Mhm.
that can be really daunting. And so one thing that Goblin Tools does, it's so cool. In fact, he just used it yesterday. You can type in something like, um, how do I clean my bedroom? And then it will ask you, like, how many steps you want it to be broken down into, and
Mhm.
it will break down into these manageable steps, like, okay, so the first step might be, right, that you gather your cleaning supplies.
Mhm.
Right? The second step might be, you get the idea.
Yep.
You declutter, right? Like maybe the second step is you get rid of things you don't want. Um, but it's the point I think we're trying to make here is that there are a lot of very useful tools out there.
Yeah.
Um, eh, whether again you're talking about time management, whether you're talking about, I'd like to learn to meditate, right? Like
Mhm.
how in the world do I go about doing that? So perhaps as we go along here, we can be collecting resources for the listeners.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. And again, throwing out there, if people have tools, ideas, strategies that work for you that you want to share with our listeners, please feel free to leave it in the comment section and or email us if there's other topics that even extend beyond like what we talked about today, if there's offshoots of overwhelm that maybe we've missed or things like that. We want to hear what you have to say.
We sure do. Yep.
Okay. Did we cover everything you want to get to today, Megan?
I feel good. Yep. I feel
Okay.
good. Again, we're not going to cover every
Right.
every facet of this, but hopefully we've given you enough to, for it to feel useful.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. As always, we love having you here. Please tune in to our next episode where we're going to be talking about leaning into your authentic self. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
If you want to share your thoughts or ideas with us, you can email us at therapyunpluggedpodcast@proton.me. Until next time, be sure to subscribe to Therapy Unplugged, Empowerment, Laughter, and Life on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere you find your podcasts.